Kad se nađemo u graničnim područjima ljudskog znanja, mnogi putokazi ponekad počnu pokazivati ne više prema van, nego prema unutra, gdje počinju i završavaju mnoge potrage za odgovorima. Jer riječ znanje obuhvaća toliko toga više od enciklopedijske količine podataka koja predstavlja tek jednu vrstu znanja. Druge vrste ljudskog znanja imaju veze sa iskustvom, doživljajem, intuicijom, svjesnošću, mudrošću. O njima su napisane 1000 knjiga i izrečene 1000 riječi. Samara, suvremeni je duhovni učitelj koji u novoj knjizi govori o trenucima koji su mu pomogli shvatiti stvarnost, ali i o mnogim drugim temama, u rasponu zdravlja, energija, svetih biljaka, ograničenja duhovnih disciplina, prirode zvukova i moralnih vrijednosti. O tome govori i ovdje, na Rubu Znanosti. Dobro večer. Samaru zovu duhovnim učiteljem, no to je samo jedan od niza mogućih opisa, jednako nesavršenih. U ovom trenutku s nama je kao sudionik razgovora na temelju kojeg je nastala knjiga Različito, a ipak isto. Dobro večer.
Hello, thank you for inviting me to your show.
Biće još prilike, nije ovo prvi put, to već znamo, a nije ni zadnji. Ovog puta bismo mogli početi sa vašim objašnjenjem kako je nastala ova knjiga koja je znatno deblja od knjiga koje inače pišete. Po tome se onda moglo zaključiti da niste u cijelosti sami pisali. I čime se knjiga zapravo bavi?
Well, this book was an inspiration, and the inspiration was my experience in life. So I don't know that it's me that wrote the book. It's basically about my experiences, my meetings with very wise people, and I try to explain this in a way where it becomes accessible to everyone in the normal everyday life. So it's not just for spiritual people or just for these groups of people, but for everyone. So it was basically a channeling or a flow of information that came through because my friend, an anthropologist, a very good anthropologist, asked me questions that were relevant to the world today, and I explained them in a way that I hope is very clear. When I look at the book, I feel that it answers many wonderful questions that are important in our civilization today for everyone and humanity.
Danas se često koristi riječ duhovnost na razne načine i mnoge druge riječi koje su već i iskrivile svoje značenje ili ga možda tek promijenili u skladu s onim tko postavlja neki pojam. Međutim, kada bismo pokušali definirati duhovnost, dakle, napraviti nečim što je bilo jednostavno razumljivo svakom, kako bi se to napravili? O čemu se tu u stvari radi?
I think that's a good question because people usually see spirituality as a religion or a sect or a cult or doing something unusual. But for me, spirituality is accessing the depth of who you are, your deep wisdom, your deep knowledge about life in a way where it is very practical. So it is not something that you have to do by going to India or Tibet or wherever, a very far away place. It's something by which you can practice living life in a much more free and open way. And I feel that this is spirituality today. It's not the religions of the past, but rather the development of consciousness in a way that allows us to express ourselves beyond the old paradigms of living, beyond the old paradigms of culture.
U knjizi je spomenuti vaš životni put. Mogli biste ukratko ispričati sa kojim ste se tradicijama na tom putu sreli? To je zapravo sljedeće pitanje koje će glasiti koje ste sve tradicije odbacili. Ali za početak čujemo malo čega sve na ovom svijetu ima.
Yes, well, basically I grew up like everyone in a very Christian culture, so I have a reference about Christianity and the spiritual meaning behind Christianity because I grew up in many countries where Christianity originated. So I have a very deep connection to Christianity, but beyond dogma. But also I was in touch with Muslims, so I understood the Muslim religion. And being a teenager, I was not so interested in what I understood, but rather trying to understand more deeply what is not so easily conveyed in the traditional religion. So I looked at Zen Buddhism, which is a form of meditation practiced in Japan, to access directly the information inside of myself, because I believe that, religion doesn't originate somewhere outside of oneself, that somehow the inspiration, the poetry, the creativity is within oneself. So Zen Buddhism is a direct way to get in touch with this through meditation and through various rituals. And I worked with a very wonderful teacher, a Zen master, called Roshi Sasaki, a very well-known Japanese teacher of Zen Buddhism, to understand spirituality in this form. And basically, when you go deeply into any spiritual tradition, you realize that everything is the same. There may be different traditions, but basically the essence, the message is the same. And that is what I came to a sense of freedom and understanding that, I want to explore everything. I don't want to just say, I'm a Buddhist or I'm a Christian or I'm this or that. So I took my journey a little bit further than just staying in the Zen Buddhist monastery where I was practicing meditation, and went and explored and communicated with wise people around the world. So I traveled to places where most tourists don't go to, the jungles of South America, the mountains of Peru, but really in the depth of those areas. So I got in touch with shamans, and these are people that use various techniques of spirituality, but also natural medicine to heal various symptoms that are not just physical, but emotional symptoms, mental symptoms, physical symptoms, and more. And I realized that spirituality is not just limited to feeling good, but actually that it can be applied in many, many ways, from healing the physical sickness of a person to changing our attitude towards life and our attitude towards ourselves. So really, it's such an immense subject, spirituality, that it's difficult to put into a few words. And this is why I wrote the book that goes into depth and explains the various topics in a concrete way. But the book is 300 or more pages in Croatian, so it explains a lot of what I understood through the various traditions. And the main ones are Buddhism and shamanism. And now my interest is very much in the ancient Christian tradition, which is not really expressed in the institutions such as the church and the old institutions. So the mystical teachings of Jesus, which I find to be very similar to many other prophets or saints, and also the ones that we don't know about, the ones that are in the world but are not so famous. Basically the message is the same. Why I'm interested in the Christian tradition is just because our culture is so influenced by this historically and in many other ways, in obvious ways and ways that are not so obvious, that I feel that rather than bring a tradition from India or from South America, it's good to understand it from within our culture and make sense of it in a more deep and profound way.
Nakon tog dijela puta koji je bio vezan uz meditacije u zen budističkom samostanu, pa nakon susreta s tim šamanima u Amazoni koji se vezuju uz ayahuasku, pa se nazivaju ayahuaskeroj, pa nakon susreta sa drugim vrstama šamana koji se pak u planinskim krajevima vežu uz neke druge biljke poput San Pedra, uputili se u Polineziju, pa na tim otocima isto bilo zanimljivih susreta i novih biljaka i svega, sve dok niste došli do Australije i Novog Zelanda. Ta količina iskustva kroz razne tradicije iznjedrila je zanimljiv zaključak, a to je da ste u svakom trenutku nakon nekog vremena kretali dalje, jer tek kad ste upoznali neku tradiciju dovoljno duboko, počeli ste uočavati njena ograničenja. naravno iz naše perspektive ta ograničenja su teško vidljiva jer nešto uvijek egzotično, daleko i time više zanimljivo. Međutim, je li zaista postoji li jedan sustav razmišljanja ili uvjerenja koji bismo mogli nazvati tako cjelovitim da odgovara na sva pitanja, ili je svaki nažalost proizvod ljudi pa ima i svoje ograničenja?
Well, that's a big question, interesting question. You're quite right. I feel that it's very easy to get caught up in a system or a culture or a belief system. And by doing that, we never go deeper into the wisdom that's within our heart. So my way was always to find the essence in every culture, the reality in every culture as I saw it, and to reflect that reflect within myself to see, if it really touched me and spoke to me, rather than me just adapting to a culture. I was trying to understand the depth of that culture and its meaning in Polynesia, Australia, New Zealand. And basically, like anyone who practices spirituality, meditation, or just lives life, in a real way, I realized that everything, wisdom, is not outside, it's inside. And everything that really makes sense, the wisdom that is inside of ourselves, is you can touch it without going out there and following one system. So the knowledge is not, this is the way, or you have to do this to be free, but rather you have to let go of all the belief systems that create this wall around our mind or our perception of the world. Let it go so deeply that the essence shines through and the wisdom speaks from the heart to you, to your mind, to your consciousness. And I feel that that is what the basic inspiration behind all spiritual traditions is. The spiritual teachers teach from that space. So for us, it is important, us human beings, to go back to that perception of coming back to the heart, so that we listen to our own unique wisdom rather than wait for someone to tell us, this is what you have to do. This is what we've done. And in the Western culture, we've always listened to school, this is how you see the world, history, geography, and it's fine because it's a form of knowledge, but it's not the knowledge that satisfied me. I wanted knowledge that was more beyond those pictures. I wanted knowledge that spoke to me, to my heart very deeply. And I think everyone can do this. So I refuse to say to people, I have found the way, and this is, forget Buddhism, forget shamanism, forget Christianity, and, this is the correct way, because anyone who does that doesn't recognize the uniqueness of each individual, and each individual sees the world a little bit differently, even though our essence is the same, we're all human beings, a little bit differently, and no one can tell you how to see that perspective except for yourself. But to see that perspective, you need to let go of all the belief systems. From when you're a little child, you're told to see the world, this is this way, and that is that way, and if you see it that way, please forget it, because then you won't fit into the social system. And the socialization creates a structure, not just in the mind, but in the emotions, and even in the body, and the muscles of the body, even the way we walk, and the way we breathe, and the way we relate to ourselves is a structure. And for me, it is about destroying that structure in a very compassionate and nice way.
Doslovce se može reći da smo mi u stvari hodajući programi. Kad se čovjek počne pitati bilo što o sebi, zapravo zaključuje da ne postoji skoro ništa što je autentično njegovo. Sve je na neki način dobio genima, kulturom, tradicijom, prijateljima, društvom, školom. Zato je možda apsurdno reći, odgovoriti na pitanje što treba naučiti kako se od svega odučiti. Ali to je škola u kojoj bi možda svako dijete htjelo ići. Da ti neko kaže, došao si u školu da se odučiš od svega.
Exactly. Unlearning is the basis of spirituality. And this is what, anthropologists found. Anthropology studies, human beings and their different perspectives. Found that, by influencing the situation by asking or perceiving questions in a certain way, you actually create the answer from that perspective. And so you're not actually asking a real question, you're just, like, as you say, being a robot and just in a nicer way or in a more profound way, going a little bit deeper into that more mechanistic point of view of the world, the socialization that you come from. So it is very difficult to let go of that, because then what do we actually hold on to? You know, if we let go of all that we know, there is nothing. And for most people that brings a little bit of panic and fear, because we want to hold on to some belief system, just even if it's a little. And I believe you have to let go of everything. The unlearning is not just unlearning the things that you don't like, but also the things that you believe that you like about your world, so that you can see what is of real value, so that you can evaluate what is important from a neutral space, not from a space where perhaps your mind that is influenced by a teacher that said you have to see the world like this, or your parents, or society, or pressures from within yourself say that, you know, you have to create this form, and then you live according to that form. And it's very difficult to explain into words, because it's a practical thing. But one thing that I find makes it easier for people to understand, that if you sit quietly and meditate, which means basically you just listen to what is going on inside rather than always being outside, we will find that the mind is much more than we think. You know, we think with 8% of the mind, 9% of the mind, psychologists say, and that behind that there is the foundation of what creates the thinking, which I call the unconscious, the creative unconscious. And this, you know, is always in the background, saying different things, creating different ideas. And to be in touch with this is very difficult for most people, because we're too busy. Our mental process is so strong that we haven't got time to listen to those more deep aspects of ourselves. And when we begin to listen to those, we realize that those deep aspects are always coming up and coming through the colors and the perceptions of the 8%. So we limit the perceptions. So even when we're inspired and when we're creative, it comes through in a very rigid and controlled way. When I look at children, or children who are a little bit more free, so usually younger children, I see that their creativity is not so tarnished by the very strong social structure. And they're amazing. Actually, I find that, you know, if you're open to children, that they teach you how to be real, how to be more human. And often I say to parents and to teachers who are working with children, and of course adults, but children much easier, you know, listen to what is really going on. And that is a matter of allowing this foundation, the 92%, which is unknown to the Western world, to come through in a very concrete way, and to speak to you in, like artists who paint beautiful pictures, to speak to you in a creative way, musical way, or like Einstein, who was a scientist and very famous for breaking the normal boundaries of science by finding out facts that were not known at his time, being inspired by something deeper than just what he learned, by something that is core in every human being. And I call this universal intelligence. And universal intelligence has the answer to everything, including spirituality, but also practical things. And this is where children are more in touch with universal intelligence, but are programmed not to listen to this because it is so important to do other things. And we have this sense of dualism, whereby, you know, we feel that there is not enough time to relax and just be. We always have to do. So we're always chasing the monkey that is in front of us, thinking that the monkey will take us there, but then we realize that the little monkey is as lost as our running around the place, and we realize that we're really in a circus and we're not doing anything. So why not just relax, and then the monkey relaxes, and then maybe we see something a bit more interesting.
Netko je to rekao na više pjesnički način, da mi nismo riječi nego tišina između riječi. Pretpostavljam da se radi o tome, ali kada već pričamo o pojmu duhovnosti, danas se na neki način sve stavlja u ladice, pa se stvari odvajaju. uobičajeno shvaćanje stvari da imamo objektivnu stvarnost koju znanost dokazuje, pa imamo tamo nekakve društvene znanosti, pa nekakve discipline koje opisno djeluju, pa imamo u nekoj larici i duhovnosti i slično. Međutim, ako bismo pokušali malo materializirati tu apstrakciju koju zovemo duhovnost, kako bismo to napravili, recimo iz perspektive društvenog poretka? Je li moguće napraviti nekakvu vezu između duhovnosti i društvenog poretka? Na koji način se oni mogu ispreplitati izvan dosadašnjih koncepata, dakle, religijskih koji su na neki način sami set nekakvih pravila. U čemu se sastoji ta veza, nešto gdje bi ljudi mogli reći, dobro, sad je ekonomska kriza, šta ću ja sad meditirati, pa ću onda se riješiti krize. Takvih često puta ima komentara na toj razini, a možda i na nekoj dubljoj društveni poredak koji bi proizlazio iz duhovnosti. Kako bi on uopće izgledao i mogao postojati?
Well, that is a big question, so I'll answer it in many different ways. I think the problem with the world today is the paradigm that we live by, and the paradigm is a very old one. Whether you look at that paradigm in a religious way, you know, our old institutions of religions, or if you look at it in an economic way, our way of dealing with the world economically, or if we look at it in a scientific way. And it always takes a few very creative and courageous people to be at the edge of what is normal, what is acceptable, and to say, you know, if we don't change, then, you know, it's not sustainable. If we don't change the economy, or if we don't change the foundation of the economy, you know, the crisis just won't go away, because the crisis is not just a chaotic, you know, situation that just happened to appear out of nowhere, and then here we are in crisis and we just hope for it to go away. It's the whole foundation of how we are dealing with the world. And this has been the case historically, not just now. You know, a few hundred years ago, people saw the world in a certain way. And if anyone stepped outside of that picture, they were criticized, and, you know, they were put in a box as being crazy or silly or stupid or whatever. But actually we realized that those people were the creative people that inspired change. And this happens in science today. Today we have science that, you know, as we explore the universe more deeply, we realize that the physics of everything doesn't really work like here on Earth. You know, we have to invent new theories and look more deeply into science to understand really what is going on. You know, it's not as simple as we think. The world is not just a little box. It's beyond the box. And so, you know, scientists today have a theory called quantum physics, and the quantum way of looking at things, which basically describes, is a more clear picture that describes the world, to me, describes the world in a realistic form. And I utilize this to understand the mind, to understand how the mind functions. So I don't see the limitations of the mind. I understand that the mind is very creative and very open in the same way as quantum physics describes that particles within the universe don't function in a very limited or linear way, that they function according to many X factors that we're just discovering now, that people are discovering within themselves, and of course then are discovering outside of themselves, because once you discover that X factor within yourself, then of course you discover that X factor within what yourself is creating outside, such as economy, culture, education, art, music. And that X factor is very important for me, because it is such an important wisdom. And for me, that wisdom is that nothing is as we see it. It's not as linear as we see it. That everything has potential, has a potential to be created in a form that is very different than our thinking. So if that is the case, then we can choose our reality rather than feel that we are bound by certain rules of economy or science. And scientists have found this, that particles actually move in a certain direction simply by the belief system that the scientist has that is observing the experiment. So, you know, it's not that they have their own limited way of moving. Everything is being created in this moment. So we are actually creators of our reality, and even creators of the physical structure that is our mind and our body and holds that reality in a certain form. So if we understand that, if quantum physics really proves this to be true, which they're slowly doing, then we can understand that we can go much beyond the limited pictures of economic crisis, and we can address it from a different perspective. And that is the different perspective that economists and scientists today are struggling to understand and to put into a real form, so that economy isn't just about competition and about plundering the resources of the earth and taking the oil out, or accumulating money and putting it in a bank and then losing the money through whatever, that there is something more interesting. And this is where we are at this moment. We are being asked to look at, the world in a different way. And some people want to go back and hope that it will stay structured in the old way because it's safe. And some people are saying, perhaps this is a deep call to all of us to change, to really change how we live.
Jedan mudar čovjek je ono što ste u početku odgovora na ovo pitanje rekli, sažeo u rečenicu, većina je u krivu. Što je na prvi pogled malo neobično, međutim kad bolje čovjek razmisli, ima logike s obzirom da većina prati, a tek manjina možda gleda iz nekog drugog kuta i nudi novu perspektivu. No, nećemo se više zamarati društvenim poretkom, mislim, barem ne u ovoj emisiji. Kad ona završi, onda ćemo se dalje zamarati društvenim poretkom i poretcima. Kroz vašu knjigu se vide susreti sa mnogim biljkama, a i mnogi antropolozi koji su dublje ulazili u materiju su zaključili da su i šamani i drugi mudraci tih, kako ih zovemo, domorodaca, govorili da su biljke ovdje puno dulje od nas, da imaju neku veću mudrost i slično. Naravno, nama koji uglavnom biljke uzgajamo na balkonima, to izgleda malo neobično i smiješno. Međutim, činjenica je da se biljke oduvijek koriste za dobivanje informacija na egzotične načine, kroz razne transfere, promjene stanja svijesti i slično. S kojim ste se vi susreli biljkama u tradiciji u raznim dijelovima svijeta i kako koja od njih radi? Koje su im sličnosti i razlike i u konačnici koja su im ograničenja? Jesu li one doista toliko svemoćne kao što njihovi šamani misle, ili imaju i one svoje ograničenja, odnosno možda ne one, nego ljudi koji ih koriste? I koje bi to uopće bile, na koji način radi?
Well, that's a good question. Because I feel that people are so out of touch with nature just because we live in a society that doesn't relate to nature in a very clear way, that we have forgotten that plants are living beings. They're not just, there. A tree is beautiful, or a plant, is just nice for my garden. That they are creatures of wisdom, and that they communicate to us. Of course they communicate to us. They clean the air, and they are part of the ecology, and they communicate to us in many subtle ways. And this is seen in our history of fairy tales and our history of telling stories, like the Scandinavians talk about sagas and various ways of mermaids and archetypal pictures of nature. And we see that they possess a wisdom and they possess a message to everyone. Everyone, loves the forest. And it's not just because the forest is beautiful, but because there is something in the forest. There is a deeper aspect in the forest that communicates to people. And shamans live in the rainforest. They are relating to the forest out of survival, but also it's their home. So they learn from when they are born how to communicate to their friends, which basically is nature, and especially plants. And shamans are probably the most wise people when it comes to using plants in very different ways, for healing physical symptoms, but also for understanding their environment, for surviving in their environment. And they have found that certain plants possess very interesting chemicals. Scientists are now looking at the chemicals that are within those plants. They say contains a spirit, contains a knowledge, a wisdom that gets transmitted to people when you utilize those plants in a very specific way. And they have been doing this for much longer than Western civilization has existed, for thousands and thousands of years. And so pharmaceutical companies today are interested because, there are chemicals that are working in ways that they don't really understand, and they're studying this. What was more interesting for me was, how do they know these things without being, without having a degree in chemistry, and, do they just go and speak to plants, or, is there a secret system that I don't know about? And I'm very curious. I always want to know how things work. It's just part of my nature. So when I was working with shamans, the people who are experts in this field, they initiated me into their perception and how they actually work with these plants. And the way you have to do it is actually by taking that internally. So in the beginning, this was cleansing the body, using plants that cleanse the liver and cleanse the kidneys and the blood, so that your body is a little bit more free. In a physical sense, you're letting go of certain structures. And then, when this happened, they introduced me to different plants, which you mentioned, called ayahuasca, which has become, more well-known by certain psychiatrists in the West, and they've investigated this in a very interesting way, and use this to create harmony in the space that they're living. This means that they're so in touch with the fundamental aspect of nature that they can utilize its power and its wisdom to do things in a practical way, to live in harmony with nature. This means to survive in nature for native people. And when I took these plants, I understood the wisdom, and it's a direct communication with nature. I understood that our perceptions are very limited, and these plants basically just open perception. They open your mind to seeing the world in a different way. Psychologists today say, some psychologists say that there are plants that change perception in a hallucinogenic sort of way. But actually, when I worked with the shamans, I realized that everyone had a different experience. So it is not like a hallucinogen or a drug, that actually it opened your mind to what was individual to yourself. So it didn't create an experience, it just opened your mind to an experience that was already there. So it works quite different from chemical substances. And this is what psychiatrists are today understanding, and they are using ayahuasca to help heal limited perceptions when it comes to, for example, neurosis or even psychosis, where people's perception is so closed that, it creates obvious sickness in a social sense. And it's interesting that this is also what the shamans have been doing. They are trying to create harmony. When there's disharmony, meaning that someone is out of balance with themselves, they use these plants like ayahuasca, San Pedro in the mountains, Kava Kava in Polynesia. And in ancient times, our Christian culture, actually utilized those plants to change perception, to open our point of view, our world, to a much deeper reality. You don't have to use the plants. I think that is a first step.
Na koji način, koja bi bila recimo razlika između tih biljaka? Primjerice, ayahuasca ima nekakve dramatičnije učinke. Spominjali se da San Pedro koji se u planinama koristi pak ima nekakve blaže fizičke učinke, pa radi na nekim drugim razinama. Na Polineziji pak nešto treće. U kojem bismo mogli uvjetno rečeno kategorije smjestiti te efekte, vizije, iskustva, iscijeljenja?
Yes. It depends where you live, Sometimes you need a very strong opening of perception, and that is basically, if you have ayahuasca, you live in the forest, and the forest is not like Hollywood, it's not a beautiful place. It is a beautiful place, but it's also a place where it's very difficult to survive. If you go to a Pacific island, it's much easier, it is more like Hollywood, it's a paradise. And so, you need a different perception of how to survive in that. You don't really need to understand things so dramatically. So ayahuasca is a very dramatic, powerful, mind-blowing experience, and this is what you need when you're in the forest. But in essence, every plant is doing the same, and that is, it opens your perception to a different reality. And the different reality is, how to touch and how to utilize the creative intelligence that is there. And that is the purpose of the plant. The purpose of the plant is not, for native people, is not to, escape, but actually to go deeper into what is going on. And so every plant probably speaks to people in different ways, because the people who grew up in Polynesia need different information from those who grew up in the jungles of South America, who need different informations from the people who grew up in Africa. And also in the West, we used certain plants which perhaps spoke to us in a different way. But in the end, the result is exactly the same. And even not utilizing those plants, if we know the techniques that the plants create within our physiology, we can do exactly the same through simple techniques which I speak about in the book, breathing and bodily postures and meditational techniques, whereby the effect is exactly the same. Maybe milder in the beginning, but with practice, the result is exactly the same.
Drugim riječima, nisu nam uvijek nužne štake, da tako kažemo. Osim toga, koliko sam shvatio, određene biljke izvan kulturnog konteksta djeluju drugačije nego unutar kulturnog konteksta u kojem su potekle, pa na taj način, pogotovo ako neko dođe kao turist za zabavu, to je opet nekakva treća priča, a ključno je to što takve proširenja percepcije mijenjaju nekakvu vrstu referentne točke, što bi u prevodu značilo da čovjek više ne zna tko je i što je, pa zato to može biti zastrašujuće. No, na koji način se može, recimo, inteligenciju prirode koristiti protiv bolesti? Recimo, znamo da postoji neka inteligencija u prirodi nama možda nedokučiva, imamo nekakve zdravstvene probleme i slično. Možemo li razgovarati s njom, možemo li nekakve namjere emitirati, ili na koji način uopće možemo tu spoznaju koristiti za dobrobit svog zdravlja?
Well, I think plants contain every cure that a human being needs, and it's just that we don't really see the complexity of those cures, and we don't have access to it. So I think it is very, very important to preserve nature, not just the rainforest, but nature everywhere, because within the DNA structure of every plant, every organism, every aspect of ecology, there is a wisdom that we are not able to access now. We think we know, but we don't know. And, it is a great pity, I see today in the world, that so many of beautiful aspects of nature is disappearing due to economic progress, due to civilization encroaching in those places where nature was so strong. Now nature is changing due to the climate change and due to the growth of too many people on Earth. So preserving nature is important, and putting some of the resources of economy into discovering how plants work, and encouraging people to approach plants in a much more creative way. By, for example, anthropologists are doing this today, and pharmaceutical companies are doing this today, going and researching how plants can actually help us in physical ways. They speak to native people who have been using these plants, and they try to adapt it to a situation that is relevant to us. For example, cancer, which is a major problem that costs lots of money in the medical sense, and also in a human sense, it creates a lot of pain, is very easy to work with. And maybe I'm sort of stepping on some people's toes here, but we just haven't been able to look deeply into that aspect of healing. We've looked at medicine, and we've looked at certain aspects of medicine too much, and we've put all our resources there. And what I feel is important, like the Chinese, who have natural medicine, like the Africans who have natural medicine, like the South Americans, is to try to understand, how nature plays a role in the healing. And this is just a matter of intention. If we are open to that, then that information comes to us. So basically, if a scientist goes to study plants, there is information there, and their intention is to find out what is there, then that happens. But if we sit and just study chemicals in a pharmacy or in a university, that's the only knowledge that we're exposed to. I know this because I studied marine biology, so basically, I understood how it is to be at university and study, which is wonderful and interesting, and how it is to go out in the world and be open to the knowledge that is out there, and that's called applied science. Mm-hmm. And, for me, that is crucial today, that we know a lot, but we have to go out there and study so that we tell people how important it is to preserve nature. It's not just nice, the tree is not just nice, it has an intelligence within the DNA structure that is useful for people today, but also for generations that will come in the future.
Logičan bi bio zaključak da je sljedeći korak da počnemo direktno razgovarati s našim bakterijama i virusima. Sve vodi prema tome, zar ne? Čini mi se čak da u tome nema nečeg posebno fantastičnog kad se gleda iz ove perspektive. No, evo negdje prema kraju emisije spomenut ćemo nešto što piše negdje pri početku knjige, to je jedna zapravo sličica, tako bismo mogli reći, sličica u kojoj razgovaraju um i srce. Poznato je naime nekima više, nekima možda manje, da često put kad kažemo ja, je pitanje ko je taj ja u stvari. I često puta je to naravno perspektiva našeg uma koje govori neko svoje ja koje mi možda i nismo i čak i ne raspoznamo ga kao drugačijeg. Kako bi prema vašoj nekakvoj mašti ili ideji izgledao razgovor uma i srca, ko tu pomaže, tko tu sabotira, kakvog lika predstavlja koji od ta dva junaka?
Okay, so the first question I'll just answer briefly because it is important. Can we talk to bacteria? I think we can, in the sense, not, in the way we're talking now, but by communicating to many dimensions of that reality, we can understand bacteria not just as something out there that we have to destroy because it's creating some sort of pain or suffering. We can understand it in a much more holistic way. People know that bacteria exists everywhere, but at certain times they mutate due to thought forms or the environment creating the space where they can mutate and become very aggressive and become very strong, so that they're out of balance with everything else that is their environment. This happens, for example, in the digestive system. If the good bacteria, meaning the probiotics within our body, get destroyed.
Stvar odjednom postaje jasna. Prvo moramo pomoći bakterijama da bismo pomogli sebi. Jesi li dobro shvatio?
Exactly. So that is the point, and that is where medicine is going. And medicine is going to a point which is very different, I believe, than it has been in the past. And it's exactly like you said, it is opening to understand rather than destroy. That is the old paradigm. And then that brings us to the second question, which is, who is I? Who am I really? Am I the businessman? Am I the human being that I think I am? Am I more? Am I less? It is a very interesting question. Once you ask that question of yourself, then I believe that is the first step to opening consciousness. Curiosity and questioning everything, as I did when I was a child. I never believed anything people said. I just would question and really try to understand why should it be this way, is the most wonderful way of opening up to reality. And reality is very difficult for me to put into words, but poets are very good at doing this, and also artists and musicians. They can transmit a feeling of reality which goes beyond the limited concepts of language, which of course are cultural, in a way where we are inspired to go beyond what we think we are. So most people believe that, I'm just this and I can't go any further. I'm this limited feeling, and I feel sometimes a little bit afraid, and I feel sometimes that I'm not good enough, and I feel that I can't do this, and I feel that it's very difficult. Are we those limitations? Or, as I believe, are we so much more, and it's just a matter of tapping into the real I, which is, I believe, divine. It is beyond the limited concepts of socialization. It is so much more. It is everything. And this divine universal consciousness is not just out there. It's not, that God or the divine aspect, the higher self, is somewhere up in the clouds and we just have to try to get there. It's actually only activated when we believe that we are what we are. If we believe that we are limited, then we stay in that limited space. If we believe that, and the belief system is not just a mental belief system, but it's a feeling. If we believe that and get in touch that we are much more, then we begin to speak to the particles, which quantum physics talk about, and we align them in the original structure, which is paradise, it is a good feeling. We begin to feel happy. We begin to feel the real value of what it is to be a human being. And when we feel this, things begin to change. Our perception of reality begins to change. And then we recognize in many aspects of our life, in relationship to ourselves, but to other people, and to objects, nature, that there is a sacredness. And when we get in touch with that, we are much more happy. And once we feel that happiness and freedom, then it's very difficult to go back to what is limited, to go back to what feels like, you're being put in a little prison. Then you're just free.
To znači da su mnoge slike zapravo dale krivi prikaz, mislim na one slike gdje čovjek u potrazi za božanstvom gleda negdje prema gore, visoko. Promašen smjer ili?
That's right, and that has been the problem, that for some reason we've been misdirected to look at things in a way. Perhaps it's useful to maintain the old structure, misdirected to look at the world by looking up in the clouds at the divine, forgetting ourselves in the process. And so we're always running, as I explained before, after that monkey. And perhaps this monkey is a sacred one, dressed up in angelic clothes. And so we're chasing that sort of divine monkey outside of ourselves, and we forget that actually, like every saint, like every spiritual teacher says, the divine is much closer to our hearts than we can ever imagine. So it is not going out there, and if we go out there, we miss the point. It is coming back to who we are, coming back to our hearts, which is coming back to feeling. And so, when we do that, we don't look out there because we begin to feel, and we open up to the subtle perceptions that understand reality. And this is, it's a natural process. It's not that we have to do many things. It's once we start that, once we set this situation in motion, then it just develops by itself. And we just think, how funny to think that the divine is sitting up in the clouds and, somehow, judging us. How funny. Well, it is funny, because then we realize that we're projecting an image onto the divine that is not real. And then we become more real inside of ourselves, and then the divine speaks to us directly. And the divine is simply what quantum physics speaks about, the big picture. The picture that is really out there, not the little picture that we human beings like to believe in, but really, reality.
Toni, hvala na posjetu i do neke sljedeće prilike. Nemojte nas zaboraviti nazvat kada opet dođete. Hvala i vama na pažnji. Uvijek je pomalo izazov o takozvanim apstraktnim stvarima pričati takozvano konkretno, ali jedna se nit svuda provlače, to je ideja da se ljudi oslobode identiteta za koji vjeruju da se s njime moraju identificirati, a posljedično naravno i svih sustava, ideja i uvjerenja za koje su spremni boriti se s drugima. A u biti, kako ispada sa samima sobom, jer na nekoj temeljnoj razini čini se sve je povezano i neodvojivo. I prava zabava naravno kreće kad se taj film može promatrati bez poistovjećivanja s njime. Kao i sve druge stvari, to je i teško i lako u isto vrijeme. Kao laka noć.